Alright, now let's get to the juicy stuff, the theory crafting, which is probably my favorite thing about the story of this game, because you look at it kind of without knowing anything, it's kind of like, okay, you know, it's mostly Midgar, and then there's some ghosts, and then Sephiroth at the end, and then it's kind of back to normal. You know, once you start looking at things and looking how they're connected to other things and then certain implications, I think there is a specifically intentional story here that is really smart and I really, really like. And so it kind of takes the story to me from just being like, oh, it's kind of, you know, just Midgar with, you know, ghosts and Sephiroth at the end, to, wow, I can't wait to see where they're going next with this story. Now, obviously there are lots of interpretations of all the information I'm going to present here, but I'm a big fan of the way Maximilian Dude, a fighting game YouTuber and streamer, who is also a big fan of FF7, who's done multiple videos talking about it. So shout out to him for bringing this stuff up and inspiring my own version of this theory. Now, Maximilian Dude has his patented level system, which is kind of like you have different levels of understanding that you, in order to understand, you know, one level, you need to understand the level below it. And so as you go up further in these levels, kind of the narrative of the game and what's happening in the game kind of changes the more that you see and the more that you understand. And so I'm going to be taking that model and I'm going to be doing a couple of my own modifications of it and ultimately end up with what's the point of doing all this. Now I'm going to go through every single level and explain it, because I think when I go in depth like this, hopefully more people can understand why some people think that this game's storytelling is actually really, really smart. I'm also going to be using parts of the FF7R Ultimania, the first one that came out like a month after the game did, in order to support some of my points, because as it turns out, a lot of what people were theory crafting turned out to be true in the Ultimania. So let's get into it. Level 1. Now this is the first level because I think this is the realization that most people who play the game come to, which is that the Whispers, which are trying to preserve the flow of time, and that they are representations of fans of the original FF7, that they don't want things to change, they want things to stay the same, and that the creators think that it's a negative, you know, it's a negative thing that they're bound to this story. I think when you actually look at what the Whispers are doing, that they're not just willy-nilly displaced there, that they are doing certain things to keep the original timeline back on track, where they do certain things to keep certain characters from not arriving too early at certain events, right? Like with the tower segment, the Whispers are just fighting them, and, you know, why are they there? Well, the party gets there right when Wedge gets hurt, so it gets it back on track with the timeline. And why were the Whispers attacking before they went to the second reactor? Well, Jesse was going to go on that mission, and so the Whispers had to hurt Jesse so Cloud could go on that mission. And I think the two that I think made people realize their intentions most directly and kind of were like, oh, I get it, was when Sephiroth stabbed Barrett and the one healed him, and then when another Whisper tried to kill Wedge. And so they will go to pretty far extremes to keep the timeline in check. They will save people from dying almost, and then kill people just to make sure that everything stays on course. And that leads me to level 2. So now you've thought about the Whispers a little bit and their intentions, and then you kind of start to question, well, why are the Whispers here? What's the point of them being here, right? If this is supposed to be a remake or a reboot entirely separate from the original, why are these Whispers here, right? Why are they trying to keep time the way it is if there is nothing to protect from the original? So what's their purpose being here, and what are they trying to stop that's different from the original? Now, there are obviously differences in the game, but I think the main deviation from the original that's here is Sephiroth being here as early as he is. So that means the Whispers are here to deliberately stop Sephiroth. I mean, Sephiroth is doing things that are deliberately messing with Cloud at a point in the story where he's not quite entirely, you know, put together, so to speak, and not quite sure about the whole plot that's happening. So because the Whispers are trying to prevent things from going off course, and Sephiroth's like the one that's causing them, right? Well, it can't be present Sephiroth, because there's nothing to, it's nothing to change unless he's from the future. Now, I know some people go even further to try to say, oh, this is definitively Sephiroth from the future, but using this thing I call the Black Wing argument, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of. Now, the Black Wing argument is kind of this idea that people like Maximilian Dood kind of cling on to, that, oh, well, I could definitely prove that Sephiroth is from the future because, you see him with a black wing in this game, and in the initial key art, and Sephiroth didn't have a wing like that until FF7 Advent Children, and so it must be because he didn't have it in the original, and he has it here, that he must have come from the future to the past. I don't like this because it kind of opens up sort of the whole, like, Sephiroth is from a future argument to, like, the argument about artistic reinterpretation, that some people argue that, well, Sephiroth now has that wing because, ever since Kingdom Hearts 1, where he got a wing in Advent Children, it's kind of been cemented into his character. And so for them to put Sephiroth with a wing in this remake isn't evidence of time travel, it's just things they added to this character that they are essentially retconning back into the original. I don't think artistic reinterpretation is going on here either. I mean, certainly there is, like, a little bit due to the nature of the higher fidelity of modern games, but we'll get into that. And the implication of traveling back in time does give a new meaning to the title remake, right? You can look at it in the video game sense of remake, as in remake something the same, but you can also look at it as kind of the opposite meaning of remake, as in make wholly anew. And so that kind of seems to be what this Sephiroth, or this version of Sephiroth's goal is. Also, there's an FF7R Ultimania interview that literally talks about this exact thing. The title for the remake is just remake, which is a bit rare to put in a title. Is there any specific meaning to it? Nomura. I am the one who decided on the title of remake, but there are two meanings to the title. The first being that we wanted to quell the doubt that arose when we first announced that we were doing a remake. When the first trailer was released, there were people who weren't sure if this installment of Final Fantasy VII was merely a remaster or an actual remake, which made them worry. When we revealed the trailer at E3 in 2015, the reactions were as I expected, with some even asking if this was going to be a movie. That's why I decided to clearly express to those with doubt that this is a complete remake of the original, with the title remake as well. In regards to the other meaning to the word remake, well, I can't answer that right now. Ask me again in a couple of years. Ha 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 ha. Now that kind of makes you start to think about it, right? Because if Sephiroth's going around doing all these things to mess with Cloud, maybe the Whispers are the good guys. Maybe it's good that the original events happen, that by killing the Arbiter of Fate at the end of the game, that the party kind of did what Sephiroth wanted, and so that whole other variable that was keeping things in check is now gone, and something way worse could happen. Now, at this point, a lot of the argument about, well, these developers are insulting the fans by, making the Whispers a metaphor for them, kind of starts to break down, because they kind of start to transcend that metaphor, because, hey, maybe it's a good thing we stick to the path of the original game. Maybe not. I think at the end of the game, there's arguments for both sides of that. Now, here's another thing that links this Sephiroth to Advent Children. So, the Whispers in Chapter 18, the three mega boss ones you fight, the cyan one, the yellow one, and the red one, if you look at their weapons and their elements and kind of, the way that they look, they weirdly match the three kids from Advent Children, Yazoo, Lodge, and Kadaj, which, by the way, all happen to be Sephiroth remnants. God, Advent Children is stupid. Now let's move on to level 3. Okay, so now you've thought about, Sephiroth, he's probably from the future because the Whispers are trying to stop him because he's not supposed to be there. Well, then you wonder, okay, are there any other characters in this game that are from the future, have some insight from the future, or something relating to that. I think the one that everybody points to as being the other character that definitely knows way more than she's letting on is Aerith. I mean, her entire character in Chapter 18 is like pretty different from the rest of the game. I don't know, there's something about not just the writing, but like the way she talks, at least in the English version, that makes her feel like different. That there's something about her that she seems entirely differently motivated.
This world, who lived and who died, who returned, are howling in pain.
Because of him, Sephiroth?
Their words, they don't reach him.
Sounds very different from kind of like the weird kooky girl, you know, that's kind of going along with everybody that we've known before, that her saying stuff like, you know, you're wrong, everything about you is wrong. Like, she definitely knows there's something up. I mean, if you don't believe me, just look at this FF7R Ultimania interview about Aerith and her writing specifically. As we played through the game, Aerith's lines left an impression on us. Nojima, Aerith is the utmost important person in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I was very careful with her lines. Each and every part of her carries a great meaning throughout the story, and I used that premise to write her character. A new mystery is born. What does Aerith know? Before Cloud even said his name, Aerith knew that he was an ex-soldier as well as a jack of all trades. She also knew where Marlene was before Tifa told her. For some strange reason, Aerith knows things even though she shouldn't yet. When Aerith touches Marlene or Red 13, they both show a very surprised expression. There must be something about Aerith that happens when she comes into contact with others. Now, the most common explanation I've seen to why such a personality disparity between early game Aerith and late game Aerith, given the small amount of time that has occurred in the general FF7 story, is the idea that because she is part of the planet, right? She's part of the life stream, that her consciousness is being sent back in time through the life stream, and by extension the planet, and is going back into her body. That the idea that her opening her eyes at the beginning of Remake is her future self sort of waking up inside of her past self and then realizing what's going on. And occasionally she snaps back into that future consciousness to try to lead the party. That's not to say that Aerith agrees with what the Whisperers are doing, because, right, if you assume the Whisperers are kind of a part of a planet and are a force of the planet to keep things on track, and Aerith, being a Cetra, is highly tied to the planet. Like, why is Aerith's goals very different from the Whisperers? Why is she so concerned about defying fate that the Whisperers have when she and the planet are on the same side of trying to protect the planet? So there's clearly some sort of disagreement going on between what she thinks would be the best outcome for everyone versus what the Whisperers and ultimately the planet thinks is going on and should be the best outcome. Now let's get to level 4, probably the most in-depth level of this whole theory. Alright, let's dive really, really deep. Let's look at every Sephiroth appearance to see if we can glean some more about what his intentions are and what's going on here. And fortunately, there's a list in the Ultimania of every Sephiroth appearance in Japanese. Now, the Ultimania states that there are 4 types of Sephiroth appearances, and I'm going to be following this categorization when talking about each of them. Now, the exact wording on some of these might be a little off because of the different translations, but... So firstly, there's Illusion, which is a Sephiroth that only Cloud can see. Secondly, there's Sephiroth's appearances through Black Cloaks, which is very similar to how he appears through most of the original game. There's Recollection, which is a memory of Sephiroth, and I find it interesting that the Ultimania distinguishes between an illusion and a memory. And then there's the most interesting one, which is the Unknown type, which appears at the end of the game. Quote, Sephiroth that is not seen through the black-cloaked man, but is visible to everyone. Now I'm going to go through his appearances chronologically throughout the game. You got all that? Okay. Now there is kind of a first hidden appearance in the intro where you can hear little bits of Sephiroth's theme, and then Aerith is kind of a little, freaked out by that. It's not listed in the Ultimania, but you could count it as one. Maybe it might be able to count it as an unknown type. Now, Sephiroth's first official appearance is in Chapter 2, when he appears directly in front of Cloud when that burning building sequence starts. Now, something that Sephiroth being here is trying to cause some sort of deliberate goal that the Whispers are trying to stop. What is an appearance this early trying to do? Like, what's the point of that, right? He leads Cloud down an alley and tells him a bunch of nonsense about, like the planet or whatever. But what's the next thing that Cloud does after that whole fire sequence? It's meet Aerith. You know what's around Aerith? It's the Whispers. And the Whispers are around her in such a way that she can't really move. So, kind of what I presume is that Sephiroth was deliberately leading Cloud down this alley just to waste enough of his time so he doesn't meet Aerith. And the Whispers, trying to correct the course of time, just kept Aerith in that one spot until Cloud would show up, so that way everything would go the same. And I think this intention is definitely reinforced with how bizarre his next appearance is, which is like when Cloud and Aerith meet, where he just literally just shows up. And I think the reason is because he's just trying to freak out Cloud and cause him to not meet Aerith or run away or something. Now, the next appearance of Sephiroth is in Chapter 3 with that whole black coat sequence. And what I kind of find interesting about this sequence is that Cloud sees the black coat as Sephiroth, but not Tifa. It seems kind of weird. I mean, granted, the rules about the black cloak stuff was kind of ambiguous in the original, but it was kind of understood that everybody saw the black coat as Sephiroth. Now, if you notice, the black cloak attacks Cloud, which I think is a nice little detail, because why would the black cloak be attacking Cloud? But because Cloud is a Sephiroth clone, then yeah, to the black cloak, Cloud looks like Sephiroth. If we saw the other side of that cutscene, it would look totally different. Now, the next appearance is in Chapter 4, where you only hear Sephiroth's voice. I don't know if it's his voice coming from the Whisper, or just that he's talking at the same time that Whisper's just kind of over there, that he kind of realizes that he can deliberately use the Whispers to his advantage. Because of his appearances in Chapter 2, trying to distract Cloud from meeting Aerith didn't work because of the Whispers interfering, and people particularly don't like the Whispers. They're really annoying and just get in the way throughout the entire game, and especially in Chapter 2, that Sephiroth realizes that, hey, if I cause a change major enough, and the Whispers have to do some drastic measures in order to keep the timeline on track, people are going to get extremely annoyed with them, and I can use that to my advantage. So he's basically setting up the destruction of the Whispers at the end of the game as early as Chapter 4. Now let's skip to Chapter 8, when Cloud falls on those flowers and is about to meet Aerith again. Again, he tries his tactic from Chapter 2, just blunt force, get in front of Cloud, distracted from Aerith, freak him out, but that doesn't work. There's also kind of stalling for time for the Turks to show up, because the Whispers later on are there when Cloud and Aerith are trying to escape from the Turks and even protect them a couple times. So Sephiroth is deliberately trying to cause the Whispers to appear, to annoy Cloud and Aerith. And yeah, the next time that Sephiroth appears is later in Chapter 8, when you do that whole thing with the kids, and then you come back, and then the Black Cloak appears, and then Cloud gets touched by the Black Cloak, and then you see Sephiroth. Again, kind of strange, because Aerith doesn't see Sephiroth, but Cloud does, so... Now, the next appearance of Sephiroth is in Chapter 13. Now, we have specifically a memory of Sephiroth saying,
"Within my veins flows the blood of ancients. This planet is my birthright."
Which does sound like something Sephiroth would say after doing all that research in a library in the Nibelheim story, so that does check out as a memory. And then we have his next appearance, which is immediately right after, which he talks about stuff about how Cloud failed and stuff. I don't know why it's listed as a different appearance. Now this next appearance is probably the coolest one in the game from just like a visual standpoint, but when you think about it, like it's just so weird and bizarre, and like the game doesn't explain how it works at all. I'm talking about that whole presentation sequence in the Shinra building, and then it turns into meteor falling on Midgar, and then Sephiroth showing up. I mean, they definitely all saw the meteor falling on Midgar, but Tifa and Barrett, like, get stabbed by Sephiroth in the illusion, and then they don't bring Sephiroth up in the 2 lines after that.
Crazy ass thing made me want to puke. And not just because of the presentation, but the content too. Ought to come with a warning. That ain't for kids.
Maybe just them being taken out in the illusion means they don't remember or see Sephiroth, but only Cloud does. It's really weird. Now this appearance brings me to something which I haven't really brought up at all prior to now, which is visions. And I couldn't really put it anywhere else in the script, so I'll just put it here. Now I find the visions really interesting, but at the same time though, it's really hard for me to kind of parse out, like, the point of them. Because, okay, well then, who's giving them? There's no real sign of that. Okay, what's the purpose of them? There's no real sign of that. I mean, even the context of these visions seems really sporadic. So, like, sometimes they seem like they're just out of context snippets, and they're just seeing something like the meteor thing with Midgar. And then other times, you have scenes like when Cloud is gonna go to Walmart and get, and then Aerith is there and then goes with him. It's deliberately framed very similarly to the scene where Aerith leaves the party and eventually results in her death. And then the remake, Cloud cries like a single tear. So like, he has the context to properly understand what this image means for him and ultimately her death in order to have that emotional response. Because depending on the context, that could really help Sephiroth's plan or not, based on if they get full context or not. Let's move on to some more simple Sephiroth appearances, because thank God the Shinra building just has a lot of Black Cloak appearances that very similarly match the original. I don't need to explain a lot. Okay, Palmer sees Sephiroth, but he's really Black Coat number 49. It's very similar to a scene in the original, blah, blah, blah. At floor 66 of the elevator, Cloud is having some, like, lines that he's remembering or maybe being fed into his head that is obviously trying to slow the party down enough so that Sephiroth can go through his rampage like he in the Shinra building like he did in the original game. Now, Chapter 17 are where most of the Black Cloak appearances are. So you have Sephiroth just there, like on the platform, and Cloud tries to attack him and that whole thing falls. And then you have that same Black Cloak later go up to President Shinra, just freaking murder him real hard. And then he turns into Genova Dreamweaver and then disappears, dies. The game doesn't really make it at all clear if he dies or not. And then you have that other Black Cloak take Genova's body and then go to the top of the Shinra building and then just jump straight off, taking Genova with him. Actually, this is probably one of the most interesting Sephiroth appearances, and I'm gonna go way into detail later. Not because of something that is there, but because of something that's missing. At the end of Chapter 17, beginning of Chapter 18, you have Sephiroth, like as an illusion, just there to try to get Cloud and the rest of them out of their vehicles. And then for the rest of Chapter 18 and throughout the rest of the game, Sephiroth's appearance is listed as the unknown type. Now for Chapter 18, I think it's kind of like obvious, right, what his intentions are. He's just trying to, like, you know, test the party's strength and get them to deliberately kill the Whispers and stuff. So, like, I don't think I need to explain every time he appears in Chapter 18, but there is one particular appearance that is very interesting and is gonna need a lot of explaining in its own level. Which brings me to level 5. Now, at the edge of creation where... No, not that one. That one. Now here, Sephiroth kind of drops his facade a little bit. At least in English, he definitely does sound differently written compared to the rest of the time we hear him talk throughout the game.
Our world will become a part of it one day, but I will not end. Nor will I have you end.
But there's something especially interesting going on in Japanese that is a deliberate change. Now, in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VII and a lot of the ancillary media, Sephiroth refers to himself prior to the Nibelheim incident using the ore pronoun. And so he just sounds like, he talks like a normal guy, like a lot of other, Japanese dudes. But it's after the Nibelheim incident that he starts using the pronoun watashi to refer to himself. Kind of what it means to represent is that Sephiroth becomes detached from his humanity, that after studying all that stuff about Jenova and that he is sort of Jenova's creation, that, well, he detaches himself from humanity and his speech patterns in Japanese reflect that. Now, how this pertains to the remake is that Sephiroth in Japanese changes the pronoun he uses from watashi back to ore during the whole exchange with Cloud.
静かにゆっくりと私たちの星が消えてしまうのだ。クラウド、我々の星はあれの一部になるらしい。俺は消えたくない。お前を消したくはない。
Now this transitions me into level 6. Looking at all of Sephiroth's appearances, like his character doesn't kind of really seem consistent across all of them. Like if we're assuming this is post-Advent Children Sephiroth, that he specifically is coming back to stop all this from happening after he failed in Advent Children, like why are there some appearances where he doesn't talk at all and he just seems to be like he was in the original, and then other times where it seems like he gloats like he's out of Advent Children. He has that fucking shitty bad guy dialogue and hating Cloud and talking about destiny and fate and all that. Now remember that scene I brought up earlier with the Black Cloak jumping with Jenova off of the Shinra building? What the weirdest thing to me about that scene is that the Black Cloak, and by extension Sephiroth, does not gloat one bit. Like, in this 40-hour game, the biggest win for Sephiroth, getting Jenova's body, Sephiroth doesn't launch into a maniacal villain rant about Cloud, you failed to stop me, and I got Jenova's body, and the worst is yet to come. But if Sephiroth's not gonna say anything, right, and you just only have the cool fall, what's the point of that cutscene, right? What's the point of it being there? If Sephiroth's not gonna say anything, and animation and development hours were wasted on this cutscene, like, there's gotta be a greater point to that cutscene, though, right? They could have just as easily saved time, development, and resources to just have Sephiroth with Jenova's body float off, like, when you're still in the Shinra office, and then you just immediately cut to the Rufus Shinra battle. Now, based on everything that I've looked at, I propose that there are actually 2 separate Sephiroths that are running around in the universe of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And yes, I know there's more than one Sephiroth in the original because of the Black Cloak stuff in his body in the Northern Crater, but listen, let's just simplify it and say there are 2 distinct, separate Sephiroth entities in the remake. There's the present one, whose body is in the Northern Crater doing stuff from the original, and then you have this future one, post-Advent Children, that is all the other appearances that aren't Black Cloak. Now, I'm guessing that either this is probably not at all shocking to people of an idea, or extremely shocking. And so to me, when I see people say, oh, FF7R is just a dumb, bad retelling of the original Midgar section with some bullshit at the end, to me, I see it very differently. After all of the stuff that I've explained to you, before I go into actually what the purpose of all of this is, I see this remake as not just telling the story of the original over again in an interesting and expanded way, but it's also kind of a meta-narrative. That the meta-narrative being of Sephiroth coming back in time and Aerith and the planet trying their best to stop him, but ultimately, they can't, and, destiny is changed, and the path of time changes, and so there might be good different things that happen, there might be bad different things that happen. Now we reach level 7. What's the point of all of this, right? Like, you can build this really cool meta-narrative through all these subtle hints, but, like, if there's no real narrative purpose to adding all this extra stuff on top of what would be a normal remake of Midgar, like, what's the point? Now, aside from the obvious, well, they need to put new stuff in there to sell to the audience and keep them engaged, and I think the purpose of all this new stuff is to serve a building of the themes on top of the original FF7. Now, I think on a broad, macro level, specific but not hyper-specific, I think that this remake series, what it's building up to, is the planet itself as a major villain in this remake series. Maybe even the ultimate villain by the time this series is over. Now, the two main reasons why I came to this conclusion was, one, some of the stuff I mentioned in the level theories earlier, but the second reason, and it's probably the most important one, is that looking at the themes of FF7, I would say probably the one that stands out most to everybody that plays it initially is the idea of, like, environmentalism. Like, we have to protect the planet, you know, life is important, we need to make sure that we don't hurt the planet and stuff. And original FF7 was kind of ahead of its time in the mainstream for talking about these kinds of issues, right? And so when we jump to, you know, 2020, FF7 Remake comes out, the way that original FF7 talked about environmentalism is so mainstreamed at this point that we're kind of sick of hearing about it. I think for us as viewers, we're tired of it. I think for Square Enix and the team working on this game, it's very tiring to just do the same thing over again. So maybe they just want to build on top of those themes and do something different with it while kind of maintaining the spirit of the original. I mean, you look at the original fiction of FF7, and then you look at, like, modern environmentalist political movements. It is actually, like, kind of freaky how much they track with each other. It is, like, kind of bizarre. I mean, you have a bunch of people who aren't necessarily religious, but really think that the planet's well-being is important for humanity's survival and has almost a kind of spiritual aspect to it. And certain groups immediately want the disuse of certain global energy structures that have caused humanity to severely prosper. I mean, based on that description, I could be talking about Avalanche from FF7 or Extinction Rebellion from the real world. I mean, there's even a hard drive article about how US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Barrett from FF7 have a lot of the same kind of talking points and convictions. But I think the thing that a lot of people tend to forget about nature is that, like, nature's not a sentient force, unless you're in a religion that literally believes that. Nature being harsh isn't like a person being harsh back to you. Like, nature doesn't care. Nature's not alive. And so, when people talk about this idea that Mother Nature is punishing us, they're kind of putting, like, a human mindset onto something that's not human. So I kind of find this idea, right, from the original FF7 of we need to take care of the planet and make sure, you know, we live sustainably and all that good kind of, you know, vanilla environmentalism type stuff. But then you add this element of, like, don't expect anything back in return if you take care of the planet, right? Like, you shouldn't abuse it, but nature's not going to be any less mean to you just because, you know, you didn't use fossil fuels or you didn't, you know, make materia or whatever. I find that, like, a really interesting direction to go. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect allegory because in the FF7 universe, the planet actually, like, is alive. Like, there is the live stream which has, you know, all of these Cetra souls and people returning to the planet and individuals get inside the live stream and stuff. But I think the general idea can be applied. And I do think they are going to do this. This remake, this early on, has such a heavy emphasis on environmentalism. Now, the original FF7 was environmentalist throughout the game, but, like, this remake just seems so hard and heavy this early, right? We haven't even gotten out of the city yet, and we've barely seen the environment, and they're hammering on so hard about environmentalism, right? That it's not just Barrett talking about it, but NPCs you walk by talk about it, and side characters have similar beliefs, and it's part of the kind of the regular day-to-day discussion of this universe about the planet and the environment and what's humanity's role. That I think they're deliberately setting this up early on, so that way in future games they can build on top of the original environmentalist themes of the original game. So I think it's necessary to have Sephiroth and Aerith come from the future back to the past, to the original Midgar section, because they've both gone through the events of the original FF7 and Advent Children, and they're kind of going through the same song and dance of the original, but the difference is that the planet kind of wants things to stay the same as they happened the first time, and Aerith doesn't. And so that kind of causes like an interesting rift. So it's interesting that both Aerith and Sephiroth, two characters that are very connected very closely with the planet, both have like a common interest in defying destiny set by the planet. Granted, probably for different reasons, Aerith having seen all the stuff that happens in the original game, and Sephiroth being the crazy bastard that he is. But given the whole pronoun change at the end of, Chapter 18 that Sephiroth has, I would not be surprised if we get a heel turn and he, joins the party or joins on the side of humanity to fight against whatever fate the planet has in store for humanity. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. And, I've never worked on a project this big before. This has been a long time in the making. I mean, not just in the fact I played 2 JRPGs for this one singular project, but also writing a script that went through a lot of changes. Like, the script is 35 pages, and that is after, like, a ton of cuts, and not only writing, but also presumably editing. That's it, and have a good day.